The Reagan Doctrine was a strategy orchestrated and implemented by the United States under the Reagan administration to overwhelm the global influence of the Soviet Union during the final years of the Cold War. While the doctrine lasted less than a decade, it was the centerpiece of United States foreign policy from the early 1980s until the end of the Cold War in 1991. Under the Reagan Doctrine, the United States provided overt and covert aid to anti-communist guerrillas and resistance movements in an effort to roll back Soviet-backed communist governments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The doctrine was designed to diminish Soviet influence in these regions as part of the administration's overall Cold War strategy. Background: the Reagan Doctrine followed in the tradition of U.S. presidents developing foreign policy doctrines, which were designed to reflect the challenges facing international relations of the times, and propose foreign policy solutions to them. The practice began with the Monroe Doctrine of President James Monroe in 1823, and continued with the Roosevelt Corollary, sometimes called the Roosevelt Doctrine, introduced by Theodore Roosevelt in 1904. The current post-World War II tradition of presidential doctrines started with the 1947 Truman Doctrine, under which the United States provided support to the governments of Greece and Turkey as part of a Cold War strategy to keep those two nations out of the Soviet sphere of influence. The Truman Doctrine was followed by the Eisenhower Doctrine, the Kennedy Doctrine, the Johnson Doctrine, the Nixon Doctrine, and the Carter Doctrine, all of which defined the foreign policy approaches of these respective U.S. presidents on some of the largest global challenges of their administrations. Origins of the Reagan Doctrine. Carter administration and Afghanistan. To watch the courageous Afghan freedom fighters battle modern arsenals with simple, handheld weapons is an inspiration to those who love freedom. U.S. President Ronald Reagan, March 21, 1983. At least one component of the Reagan Doctrine technically predated the Reagan presidency. In Afghanistan, the Carter administration began providing limited covert military assistance to Afghanistan's mujahideen in an effort to drive the Soviets out of the nation, or at least raise the military and political cost of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. The policy of aiding the mujahideen in their war against the Soviet occupation was originally proposed by Carter's national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski and was implemented by U.S. intelligence services. It enjoyed broad bipartisan political support. Democratic Congressman Charlie Wilson became obsessed with the Afghan cause, and was able to leverage his position on the House Appropriations Committees to encourage other Democratic congressmen to vote for CIA Afghan war money, with the tacit approval of Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, even as the Democratic Party lambasted Reagan for the CIA's secret war in Central America. It was a complex web of relationships described in George Crowley's book Charlie Wilson's War. Wilson teamed with CIA manager Gustav Rakotos and formed a team of a few dozen insiders who greatly enhanced the support for the Mujahideen, funneling it through Zerul Haq's ISI. Rakotos and Wilson charmed leaders from various anti-Soviet countries including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and China to increase support for the rebels. Rakotos hired Michael G. Vickers, a young paramilitary officer, to enhance the guerrillas' odds by revamping the tactics, weapons, logistics, and training used by the Mujahideen. Michael Pillsbury, a Pentagon official, and Vincent Cannistraro pushed the CIA to supply the Stinger missile to the rebels. President Reagan's Covert Action Program has been given credit for assisting in ending the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Heritage Foundation initiatives. With the arrival of the Reagan administration, the Heritage Foundation and other conservative foreign policy think tanks saw a political opportunity to significantly expand Carter's Afghanistan policy into a more global doctrine, including U.S. support to anti-communist resistance movements in Soviet-allied nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. According to political analysts Thomas Bodenheimer and Robert Gould, it was the Heritage Foundation that translated theory into concrete policy. Heritage targeted 9 nations for rollback: Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Iran, Laos, Libya, Nicaragua, and Vietnam. Throughout the 1980s, the Heritage Foundation's foreign policy expert on the Third World, Michael Johns, the Foundation's principal Reagan Doctrine advocate, visited with resistance movements in Angola, Cambodia, Nicaragua, and other Soviet-supported nations and urged the Reagan administration to initiate or expand military and political support to them. Heritage Foundation foreign policy experts also endorsed the Reagan Doctrine in 2 of their Mandate for Leadership books, which provided comprehensive policy advice to Reagan administration officials. The result was that, in addition to Afghanistan, the Reagan Doctrine was rather quickly applied in Angola and Nicaragua, with the United States providing military support to the UNITA movement in Angola and the Contras in Nicaragua, but without a declaration of war against either country. Addressing the Heritage Foundation in October 1989, UNITA leader Jonas Savimbi called the Heritage Foundation's efforts a source of great support. "No Angolan will forget your efforts. You have come to Jamba, and you have taken our message to Congress and the administration." U.S. aid to UNITA began to flow overtly after Congress repealed the Clark Amendment, a long-standing legislative prohibition on military aid to UNITA. Following these victories, Johns and the Heritage Foundation urged further expanding the Reagan Doctrine to Ethiopia, where they argued that the Ethiopian famine was a product of the military and agricultural policies of Ethiopia's Soviet-supported Mengistu Haile Mariam government. Johns and Heritage also argued that Mengistu's decision to permit a Soviet naval and air presence on the Red Sea ports of Eritrea represented a strategic challenge to U.S. security interests in the Middle East and North Africa. The Heritage Foundation and the Reagan administration also sought to apply the Reagan Doctrine in Cambodia, the largest resistance movement fighting Cambodia's communist government was largely made up of members of the former Khmer Rouge regime, whose human rights record was among the worst of the 20th century. Therefore, Reagan authorized the provision of aid to a smaller Cambodian resistance movement, a coalition called the Khmer People's National Liberation Front, known as the KPNLF and then run by Sun San, in an effort to force an end to the Vietnamese occupation. Eventually, the Vietnamese withdrew, and Cambodia's communist regime fell. Then, under United Nations supervision, free elections were held. While the Reagan Doctrine enjoyed strong support from the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, the libertarian-oriented Cato Institute opposed the Reagan Doctrine, arguing in 1986 that most Third World struggles take place in arenas and involve issues far removed from legitimate American security needs. U.S. involvement in such conflicts expands the Republic's already overextended commitments without achieving any significant prospective gains. Instead of draining Soviet military and financial resources, we end up dissipating our own. Even Cato, however, conceded that the Reagan Doctrine had fired the enthusiasm of the conservative movement in the United States as no foreign policy issue has done in decades. While opposing the Reagan Doctrine as an official governmental policy, Cato instead urged Congress to remove the legal barriers prohibiting private organizations and citizens from supporting these resistance movements. Reagan administration advocates within the Reagan administration. The doctrine was quickly embraced by nearly all of Reagan's top national security and foreign policy officials. including Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, and a series of Reagan national security advisors including John Poindexter, Frank Caolucci, and Colin Powell. Reagan himself was a vocal proponent of the policy, seeking to expand congressional support for the doctrine. In the 1985 State of the Union address in February 1985, Reagan said, "We must not break faith with those who are risking their lives, on every continent, from Afghanistan to Nicaragua, to defy Soviet aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth." Support for freedom fighters is self-defense. As part of his effort to gain congressional support for the Nicaraguan Contras, Reagan labeled the Contras the moral equivalent of our founding fathers, which was controversial because the Contras had shown a disregard for human rights. There also were allegations that some members of the Contra leadership were involved in cocaine trafficking. Reagan and other conservative advocates of the Reagan Doctrine also argued that the doctrine served U.S. foreign policy and strategic objectives and was a moral imperative against the former Soviet Union, which Reagan, his advisors, and supporters labeled an evil empire. Other early conservative advocates for the Reagan Doctrine included influential conservative activist Grover Norquist, who ultimately became a registered UNITA lobbyist and an economic advisor to Savimbi's UNITA movement in Angola, and former Reagan speechwriter and current U.S. Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who made several secret visits with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and returned with glowing reports of their bravery against the Soviet occupation. Rohrabacher was led to Afghanistan by his contact with the Mujahideen, Jack Wheeler. Phrase's origin in 1985, as U.S. support was flowing to the Mujahideen, Savimbi's UNITA, and the Nicaraguan Contras. Columnist Charles Krauthammer, in an essay for Time magazine, labeled the policy the Reagan Doctrine, and the name stuck. Rollback replaces containment. The Reagan Doctrine was especially significant because it represented a substantial shift in the post-World War II foreign policy of the United States. Prior to the Reagan Doctrine, U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War was rooted in containment, as originally defined by George F. Kennan, John Foster Dulles, and other post-World War II U.S. foreign policy experts. In January 1977, 4 years prior to becoming president, Reagan bluntly stated, in a conversation with Richard V. Allen, his basic expectation in relation to the Cold War: "My idea of American policy toward the Soviet Union is simple, and some would say simplistic," he said. "It is this: we win and they lose. What do you think of that?" Although a similar policy of rollback had been considered on a few occasions during the Cold War, the U.S. government, fearing an escalation of the Cold War and possible nuclear conflict, chose not to confront the Soviet Union directly. With the Reagan Doctrine, those fears were set aside and the United States began to openly confront Soviet-supported governments through support of rebel movements in the doctrine's targeted countries. One perceived benefit of the Reagan Doctrine was the relatively low cost of supporting guerrilla forces compared to the Soviet Union's expenses in propping up client states. Another benefit was the lack of direct involvement of American troops, which allowed the United States to confront Soviet allies without sustaining casualties, especially since the September 11 attacks. Some Reagan Doctrine critics have argued that, by facilitating the transfer of large amounts of weapons to various areas of the world and by training military leaders in these regions, the Reagan Doctrine actually contributed to blowback by strengthening some political and military movements that ultimately developed hostility toward the United States. such as Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. However, scholars such as Jason Burke, Steve Cole, Peter Bergen, Christopher Andrew, and Vasily Mitrokhin have argued that Osama bin Laden was outside of CIA eyesight, and that there is no support, in any reliable source, for the claim that the CIA funded bin Laden or any of the other Arab volunteers who came to support the Mujahideen. However, the American aid that was given to Pakistan's ISI to give to the Mujahideen created long-lasting links between Mujahideen and Pakistan's Secret Service. Later, during the Afghan Civil War, Pakistan sought to promote a faction that would promote its interests, and potentially help Pakistan in a feared new conflict with India. This led to Pakistani support for the rise of the Taliban, who were later willing to become allies of Al-Qaeda. Controversy over Nicaragua. Historian Greg Grandin described a disjuncture between official ideals preached by the United States and actual U.S. support for terrorism. Nicaragua, where the United States backed not a counterinsurgent state but anti-communist mercenaries, likewise represented a disjuncture between the idealism used to justify U.S. policy and its support for political terrorism, the corollary to the idealism embraced by the Republicans in the realm of diplomatic public policy. Debate was thus political terror. In the dirtiest of Latin America's dirty wars, their faith in America's mission justified atrocities in the name of liberty. Grandin examined the behavior of the U.S.-backed Contras and found evidence that it was particularly inhumane and vicious. In Nicaragua, the U.S.-backed Contras decapitated, castrated, and otherwise mutilated civilians and foreign aid workers. Some earned a reputation for using spoons to gouge their victims' eyes out. In one raid, Contras cut the breasts of a civilian defender to pieces and ripped the flesh off the bones of another. Professor Frederick H. Garrow has written that the Contras attacked bridges, electric generators, but also state-owned agricultural cooperatives, rural health clinics, villages, and non-combatants. U.S. agents were directly involved in the fighting. CIA commandos launched a series of sabotage raids on Nicaraguan port facilities. They mined the country's major ports and set fire to its largest oil storage facilities. In 1984, the U.S. Congress ordered this intervention to be stopped. However, it was later shown that the Reagan administration illegally continued. Garrow has characterized these acts as wholesale terrorism by the United States. A CIA manual for training the Nicaraguan Contras in psychological operations, leaked to the media in 1984, entitled Psychological Operations in Guerrilla War, recommended selective use of violence for propagandistic effects, and to neutralize government officials. Nicaraguan Contras were taught to lead selective use of armed force for PSYOP psychological operations effect. Carefully selected, planned targets, judges, police officials, tax collectors, etc., may be removed for PSYOP effect in the UWOA unconventional warfare operations area. But extensive precautions must ensure that the people concur in such an act by thorough explanatory canvassing among the affected populace before and after conduct of the mission. James Bovard, Freedom Daily. Similarly, former diplomat Clara Nieto, in her book Masters of War, charged that the CIA launched a series of terrorist actions from their mothership off Nicaragua's coast. In September 1983, she charged the agency attacked Puerto Sandino with rockets. The following month, frogmen blew up the underwater oil pipeline in the same port, the only one in the country. In October there was an attack on Puerto Corinto, Nicaragua's largest port, with mortars, rockets, and grenades blowing up 5 large oil and gasoline storage tanks. More than 100 people were wounded, and the fierce fire, which could not be brought under control for 2 days, forced the evacuation of 23,000 people. The International Court of Justice, when judging the case of Nicaragua v. United States in 1984, found that the United States was obligated to pay reparations to Nicaragua, because it had violated international law by actively supporting the Contras in their rebellion and by mining the naval waters of Nicaragua. The United States refused to participate in the proceedings after the court rejected its argument that the ICJ lacked jurisdiction to hear the case. The U.S. later blocked the enforcement of the judgment by exercising its veto power in the United Nations Security Council and so prevented Nicaragua from obtaining any actual compensation. Supporters of the Reagan administration have pointed out that the United States had been the largest provider of aid to Nicaragua, and twice offered to resume aid if the Sandinistas agreed to stop harming the communist insurgency against the military government in El Salvador. Former official Roger Miranda wrote that Washington could not ignore Sandinista attempts to overthrow Central American governments. Nicaragua's Permanent Commission on Human Rights condemned Sandinista human rights violations, recording at least 2,000 murders in the first 6 months and 3,000 disappearances in the first few years. It has since documented 14,000 cases of torture, rape, kidnapping, mutilation, and murder. The UN International Commission of Jurists found that the Sandinista People's Courts aimed to suppress all political opposition. The Permanent Commission on Human Rights identified 6,000 political prisoners. The Sandinistas admitted to forcing 180,000 peasants into resettlement camps. Leading Sandinistas saw the revolt as a popular uprising. The Contras became a campesino movement with its own leadership. They had a large social base in the countryside. The integration of thousands of peasants into the counter-revolutionary army was provoked by the policies, limitations and errors of Sandinismo. Many landless peasants went to war to avoid the state collectives, and Contra commanders were small farmers, many of them without any ties to Somosism, who had supplanted the former Somoza National Guard officers. Thus, it is not universally accepted that the majority of Contras resorted to terroristic tactics. Jamie Glazer, comparing the Sandinistas to the Khmer Rouge, wrote, "The Sandinistas inflicted a ruthless, forcible relocation of tens of thousands of Indians from their land. Like Stalin, they used state-created famine as a weapon against these enemies of the people. The Sandinista army committed myriad atrocities against the Indian population, killing and imprisoning approximately 15,000 innocent people. Covert implementation. As the Reagan administration set about implementing the Heritage Foundation Plan in Afghanistan, Angola, and Nicaragua, it first attempted to do so covertly, not as part of official policy. The Reagan government's initial implementation of the Heritage Plan was done covertly, according to the book Rollback. Following the long-standing custom that containment can be overt but rollback should be covert. Ultimately, however, the administration supported the policy more openly. Congressional votes. While the doctrine benefited from strong support from the Reagan administration, the Heritage Foundation and several influential members of Congress, many votes on critical funding for resistance movements, especially the Nicaraguan Contras, were extremely close, making the Reagan Doctrine one of the more contentious American political issues of the late 1980s.